She called her mother on a Friday afternoon, and she sounded happy, genuinely, completely happy. She was heading out to her boyfriend's family farm for the 4th of July weekend, and her mother hung up the phone without a second thought, without a lingering worry, without any of the small hesitations that a parent sometimes feels when something is quietly wrong. Because nothing felt wrong, nothing felt off. Nothing in that conversation gave Sherry Ballard any reason at all to hold her breath. That was the last time she would ever hear her daughter's voice. Then Saturday came and went without a single call, without a single text, without a single word. Sunday arrived, and the silence only deepened. By Sunday, July 5th, 2015, Sherry Ballard had moved well beyond worry. She had crossed into something darker and more certain, the kind of fear that does not ask questions anymore, because it already knows the answer. And when she reached out to authorities that day, it was not simply to report that her daughter had not come home. It was because somewhere deep and unshakable inside her, she already knew that her daughter was gone in a way that had nothing to do with choosing to leave. When Crystal Rogers' red Chevrolet Impala turned up abandoned on the Bluegrass Parkway with a flat tire, keys still sitting in the ignition, purse resting on the seat, and her phone lying there like it was waiting to ring, that gut feeling stopped being a feeling and became a certainty. Crystal Rogers was not the kind of woman who walked away from her 5 children. She was not the kind of woman who left without a word, without a goodbye, without even a text message to say she needed space. She was the kind of woman who painted her entire world in pink, who called her sister her absolute best friend, who adored her children in the daily, present, unmistakable way that people who truly love their kids do. And she had a mother who would spend the next 10 years tearing apart the state of Kentucky with her bare hands, if that was what it took to find her. This is the story of Crystal Rogers, a mother, a daughter, a sister, a woman whose disappearance from a small Kentucky town pulled back the curtain on something deeply troubling festering just beneath the surface of a community that prided itself on knowing everyone's business, and a family that refused year after year after year to let the world move on and forget her name. That is the story we are telling today on True Crime Web. Crystal Maria Ballard was born and raised in Bardstown, Kentucky, a small and deeply familiar city that most people outside the state know primarily for its bourbon distilleries, its rich Catholic heritage, and the kind of tight-knit community where your neighbors have known your family for 3 generations and can name your car from half a mile away. Crystal did not just pass through Bardstown. She grew up inside it, went to school within it, and spent 35 years building the full architecture of her life there, layer by layer, relationship by relationship, child by child. Her parents were Tommy and Sherry Ballard, and anyone who spent any time around the Ballard family understood instinctively that they were close in the way that actually means something. Not just close in the sense of living nearby or sharing holiday dinners, but close in the sense that they showed up for each other without being asked, that they noticed when something was wrong before anyone said a word, and that the love between them was not something they had to perform or announce. Tommy was steady and solid in the way that quiet, dependable men often are. He was a hunter, a hard-working man, someone who was genuinely present in the lives of the people he loved, rather than simply nearby. Sherry was the center of the family's awareness, the one who kept track of everyone, the one who could read a silence and understand exactly what it meant, the one whose instincts had been sharpened by decades of paying close attention to the people she loved most in the world. By the time Crystal reached her mid-30s, she had 5 children, and she was known above every other thing as a mother. Not in an abstract or biographical sense, not simply as a category on a missing persons report, but in the daily, tangible, deeply lived sense that people who knew her described without hesitation. The FBI would later capture it almost perfectly in their public case profile, stating plainly that Crystal Rogers was not known to go anywhere without her children. That single sentence, that one uncomplicated observation, tells you more about who Crystal was than almost anything else could. She did not leave. She did not disappear. She did not step away from her children without a word. That was not who she was, and everyone who knew her understood that without having to think about it. Her sister, Brooke Bryan, called Crystal her best friend, and she meant it in every sense that the phrase is capable of carrying. They talked the way sisters who have grown up together and never truly grown apart talk, about everything and nothing, about the big things and the small things, about the ordinary rhythms of daily life that make up most of what a life actually is. Crystal's favorite color was pink, a detail so specific and so personal that her family would later carry it forward deliberately and visibly, using it as a thread connecting the community to her memory in the years when keeping that memory alive required constant effort and intention. She was 35 years old when she disappeared from the earth. She was someone's daughter and someone's sister and 5 children's mother, and a woman in the middle of her life who was still figuring out what that life was supposed to look like. And in the summer of 2015, part of what she was navigating was a relationship with a man named Brooks Houck. Brooks Houck was not a stranger to Bardstown. He was a local in every meaningful sense of the word, a businessman with deep roots in Nelson County, considerable property holdings, and a name that people recognized and associated with a certain kind of local standing and success. By the time he and Crystal were involved with each other, Brooks had built what looked from the outside like an extraordinarily substantial life. Property records in Nelson County would later reveal that he, or companies directly connected to him and controlled by him, owned 73 properties with a combined value of nearly $13.5 million. He was registered as the agent for multiple distinct business entities, including Houck Rentals LLC, Select Quality Homes LLC, and Central Kentucky Real Estate Rentals LLC. He built homes, he rented properties, he employed members of the local community, and he operated within a network of business relationships that gave him visibility, credibility, and a degree of social insulation that would matter enormously in the years ahead. Crystal and Brooks shared a young son named Eli, who was just 2 years old in the summer of 2015, still a toddler in that particular phase of early childhood where every single morning arrives carrying something entirely new. Approximately 6 weeks before Crystal disappeared, she sent Brooks a text message that would later be presented to a jury during trial proceedings. In that message, Crystal told him that she could not keep dealing with the way he treated her, that she was exhausted from always feeling like she was placed on the back burner of his attention and his priorities, and that something between them had to fundamentally change. Brooks responded by asking her to come back home and telling her that running away from problems was not going to solve anything between them. It was, in its way, an entirely ordinary exchange, painful the way that painful things can also be familiar and recognizable. 2 people inside a relationship that was not working, trying to negotiate something through the distance of a screen rather than through actual presence and honesty with each other. Nothing in that single exchange of messages proves anything on its own, standing alone, but it tells you something true and important about where Crystal was emotionally and mentally in those final weeks of her life. She was not a woman without feelings. She was not a woman who had made her peace with a situation that was hurting her. She was a woman who was frustrated, who knew her own worth, who wanted something more and better, and who was actively trying to figure out what her life was supposed to look like going forward. She never got the chance to find that answer. The 4th of July weekend in Bardstown in 2015 looked from the outside like it was going to be entirely unremarkable in the best possible sense of that word. Families were planning cookouts and gathering in backyards. Children were counting down the hours to fireworks. The air carried that particular slow and easy rhythm that settles over small American towns on summer holidays, a collective exhale, a shared pause from the ordinary pace of things. On the evening of July 3, 2015, Crystal Rogers went to the Houck family farm with Brooks Houck. The visit was framed as a night without the children, something positioned somewhere between a deliberate date and an ordinary visit to a familiar place, depending on who you asked and what version of events they were working from. Brooks later told investigators that the 2 of them were together at the farm from approximately 7 in the evening until around midnight. What happened at that farm during those hours, and in the hours that followed, is the question that would haunt every person connected to this case for the next 10 years. At 11:57 that night, Crystal Rogers' phone went completely dark. Testimony presented at trial would establish clearly that her phone had been actively in use throughout the evening, registering the ordinary digital fingerprints of a person going about a normal night, games being played, Facebook being checked, the unremarkable background noise of modern life. And then, at 11:57 in the evening, the phone was manually shut off. Not dropped, not lost, not broken, manually shut off. Brooks told investigators that when he woke up the following morning, Crystal was simply gone. Her car was not in the driveway. He said he assumed she had gone out somewhere with friends, and that he was not immediately concerned or alarmed by her absence. But a digital forensics expert, who testified at trial, told an entirely different story about Brooks Houck's own movements during that critical window of time. That expert testified that cell phone data placed Brooks at or very near the family farm for much of July 3rd, and that his actual documented timeline of movements did not align with the account he had given to investigating officers. The expert testified specifically that Brooks did not leave the farm at the time he claimed he did. Something happened at that farm between the moment Crystal's phone went dark at 11:57 in the evening and the moment morning arrived and she was described as simply gone. No one who has since been convicted and sentenced in this case has ever said what that something was. On July 5, 2015, Sherry Ballard reported her daughter missing to authorities. It had been 2 full days since Crystal had last been seen or heard from, 2 days of complete silence, 2 days of calls going directly to voicemail, 2 days of a mother's instinct building and building inside her into something she could no longer contain or rationalize away. That same day, Crystal's red Chevrolet Impala was located near mile marker 14 on the Bluegrass Parkway in Bardstown, sitting on the shoulder of the highway with a flat tire, keys inside, phone inside, purse inside, every element of her daily life arranged inside that car exactly as it would have been if she had simply stepped away to stretch her legs and would return at any moment. This is the image that has never left this case and never will. A woman's entire daily existence sitting undisturbed in a parked car on the side of a highway, patient and complete, as though the woman herself had simply paused and would be back before anyone had time to notice she was gone. For Crystal's family, there was nothing remotely ambiguous about what they were looking at. Crystal would not abandon her car on the side of a road. Crystal would not leave her purse sitting on a car seat. And above every other consideration, Crystal Rogers would not leave 5 children without a word, without a phone call, without any contact whatsoever. These were not assumptions her family was making. These were facts about who Crystal was, confirmed by every person who had ever known her. The car had not been left where Crystal was last seen. Someone had moved it there deliberately. Years later, at trial, the full story behind that vehicle would finally be placed on the record in open court. A man named Stephen Lawson, who was connected to Brooks Houck through a network of relationships that would take investigators years to fully map, admitted during proceedings that he had been directly involved in moving Crystal's vehicle after she disappeared. He testified that his son, Joseph Lawson, had driven Crystal's car, and that he himself had picked Joseph up after the vehicle suffered a flat tire, leaving it on the shoulder of the Bluegrass Parkway right where it was eventually found. A witness named Rebecca Greer testified that she had overheard Joseph Lawson speaking about receiving $50,000 in exchange for moving a car, and that he had made very clear this was not something that should ever be brought up or discussed again. Another witness came forward to testify that Stacey Kramer had heard Stephen Lawson say that Brooks Houck had a woman with 5 kids who needed to be taken care of, and that when Kramer asked whether that meant something like a rehabilitation program, Stephen allegedly replied that he wished that were the case. That abandoned car was never simply a clue sitting on a highway shoulder. It was a deliberate act, carefully executed, intended to construct the impression of a woman who had driven somewhere of her own volition and simply walked away from her life. She had not. Nelson County authorities began investigating Crystal's disappearance almost immediately after she was reported missing, and attention turned toward Brooks Houck almost as quickly. He was the last person known to have seen Crystal alive. He was the father of her youngest child. He was the man she had been texting about feeling undervalued and frustrated. He was the person connected to the farm, the last physical place anyone could put Crystal Rogers on this earth. In October of 2015, the Nelson County Sheriff, formally and publicly named Brooks Houck as the sole suspect in Crystal's disappearance. But in the world of criminal investigations, naming a suspect and charging one are two entirely different things, separated by evidence, procedure, and the heavy standard of what can actually be proven in a court of law. In the months that followed that announcement, the case began to feel stalled in a way that was becoming harder and harder to ignore or explain away. Part of the reason the investigation felt stuck had to do with Brooks Houck's brother, Nick Houck, who was at that time a serving officer with the Bardstown Police Department. During an early investigative interview with Brooks, Nick Houck called his brother directly and advised him not to speak with the investigators who were trying to question him. That phone call would later be described by those familiar with the case as one of the most extraordinary moments of interference in the entire investigation. Nick Houck was a law enforcement officer. He understood from the inside how criminal investigations are built and how they can be disrupted. He had access to knowledge and context that an ordinary citizen would never possess, and he used all of that to advise the prime suspect in his own niece's mother's disappearance to stop talking to the people trying to find out what had happened to her. Nick Houck was eventually terminated from the Bardstown Police Department on the grounds that he had interfered with an active investigation. He also failed a polygraph examination administered in connection with the case. But for a significant period of time afterward, he faced no criminal charges for what he had done. The investigation pressed forward, but it moved with a slowness that Crystal's family found increasingly unbearable. While investigators worked the case at their own pace, Crystal's father, Tommy Ballard, was doing something that would come to define every remaining day of his life. He formed an organization called Team Crystal, a dedicated and growing group of community members, family, and friends who committed themselves to finding Crystal and to making sure that the pressure on authorities for real answers never let up for a single day. Tommy was a hunter by experience and by instinct, a man who knew the land surrounding Bardstown more intimately than most people ever would. He organized searches of fields, wooded areas, and roadsides. He attended vigils and drove to hearings and gave interviews to anyone with a microphone or a camera who was willing to listen and to help keep Crystal's name in front of the public. He stood before cameras again and again and asked anyone with any knowledge of what had happened to his daughter to come forward. He painted his daughter's memory across the landscape of a town that had known her all her life. 3 years after Crystal vanished, Sherry Ballard organized a community effort that placed hundreds of pink mason jars bearing Crystal's photograph throughout Bardstown, each one carrying the message, "Prayers for Crystal," each one a small, visible refusal to let her be forgotten. More than 200 people gathered for a memorial service at St. Thomas Church, and a family friend described the gathering as an act of collective love, directed not only toward Crystal, but toward her 5 children, all of whom were growing up with an absence at the center of their lives that no amount of community warmth or legal proceedings could ever fill. Crystal's daughter, Kylie Fenwick, had been 14 years old when her mother disappeared. She graduated from high school without her mother in the audience. She graduated from college without her mother there to see it. She grew into a young woman who would one day stand inside a courtroom and tell a jury, in her own voice and in her own words, what that absence had looked and felt like from the inside of it, day after day, year after year. Then, on November 19th, 2016, 16 months after Crystal Rogers had vanished, the case took a turn so devastating that it felt almost impossible to absorb. Tommy Ballard was preparing for a hunting trip with his 12-year-old grandson on family property near the Bluegrass Parkway. He was shot once in the chest by an unknown person who was never identified, never apprehended, and never charged. He died at the scene of that shooting. His 12-year-old grandson was present when it happened. Tommy Ballard was murdered while he was actively searching for his missing daughter. His killing remains officially unsolved to this day. The FBI continues to offer a reward of up to $10,000 for information that leads to the arrest of whoever pulled that trigger, and that reward remains unclaimed. The case that had already stolen Crystal Rogers from her family had now taken Tommy Ballard as well. Sherry Ballard had lost her daughter, she had now lost her husband, and she still did not know where Crystal was or what had been done with her. By 2020, the Crystal Rogers investigation had grown far beyond what local authorities could effectively manage on their own, and the FBI formally assumed control of the case. Federal agents began conducting searches of properties connected to the Houck family, including the farm where Crystal was last seen, residential properties linked to both Brooks and Nick Houck, and land associated with Brooks' construction business. In 2021, federal attention focused specifically on a residential subdivision called Woodlawn Springs, a development where Brooks Houck had been actively building homes right around the time Crystal Rogers disappeared in the summer of 2015. What investigators did at that subdivision became one of the most striking visual moments in a case that had already produced many of them. Federal agents physically tore up a concrete driveway. They pulled back the earth beneath it and dug several feet below the surface, searching for what might have been concealed there years before. The FBI announced publicly that agents had recovered an item of interest at that location, but declined to state what that item was. The image of federal investigators ripping into concrete in a quiet Kentucky neighborhood, methodically searching for what might lie beneath a driveway poured by the prime suspect in an active murder investigation, embedded itself permanently into the public consciousness of the case. Investigators also directed significant attention toward a white Buick that had previously belonged to Brooks Houck's grandmother. The vehicle had been sold after Crystal's disappearance, but before it changed hands, a hair described as consistent with Crystal's was discovered inside the trunk. A cadaver dog, trained specifically to detect the biological traces left by human remains, also alerted to that same vehicle. FBI laboratory analysis was ultimately inconclusive, and no confirmed DNA profile was established. But those two things together, the hair and the dog's alert, were not the kind of details that investigators or juries tend to simply set aside. A former employee connected to the Houck operation came forward to tell investigators that Joseph Lawson had made deeply disturbing statements about Crystal Rogers and about what may have happened to her remains after her death. Separately, investigators received credible information that Joseph Lawson had been observed on a farm on Thompson Hill Road within 5 days of Crystal's disappearance, using heavy construction equipment to dig into the earth and burning wood in a large, open pit. That property was searched. No criminal charges resulted specifically from that location, but Crystal's body had still not been recovered, and the picture of what had likely happened was becoming more detailed and more damning with every passing month. 8 years. That is how long Crystal Rogers had been missing, how long her children had grown up without her, how long Tommy Ballard had been saying her daughter's name in rooms full of people who kept promising that justice was coming before the arrests finally arrived. In 2023, federal and state authorities moved together, and they moved decisively. Joseph Lawson was the first to be indicted, charged with conspiracy to commit murder and with tampering with physical evidence. Then came the arrest that Crystal's family had spent nearly a decade holding themselves together long enough to witness. Brooks Houck was taken into custody and charged with murder and with tampering with physical evidence. His bond was set at $10 million cash. Stephen Lawson was charged later that same year with offenses that mirrored those of his son. For the first time since October of 2015, when he had first been publicly named as a suspect, the man who had continued living his ordinary life in Bardstown while Crystal's family demanded answers and buried Tommy and watched her children grow older without her, was finally in handcuffs and facing a courtroom. Because of the enormous and sustained media attention surrounding the case throughout Nelson County and the broader region, all proceedings were moved to Warren County, Kentucky, to ensure that a fair and impartial jury could be assembled away from the immediate weight of local history and community connection. Stephen Lawson was tried first. In May of 2025, he was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and tampering with physical evidence. In August of 2025, he was sentenced to 17 years in prison. Then came the trial that everything had been building toward for a decade. Brooks Houck and Joseph Lawson were tried together over the course of 10 days in a proceeding that brought more than 50 witnesses to the stand and placed before the jury a carefully assembled mosaic of cell phone data, surveillance footage, recorded police interrogations, expert forensic testimony, and witness accounts from individuals who described a network of people who had known what happened to Crystal Rogers and had chosen again and again to say nothing. Prosecutors built their case out of fragments, the way the most difficult and important cases often must be built, because the people responsible for Crystal's death had made sure there was nothing simple or obvious left behind for investigators to find. A phone manually shut off at 11:57 in the evening, a timeline that collapsed under the weight of digital evidence. A car moved from the scene and staged on a highway shoulder, testimony about $50,000 paid to ensure silence, witnesses describing conversations in which Crystal's fate was openly discussed as something that had been arranged and paid for, former associates recounting horrifying statements about how her remains may have been disposed of, a cadaver dog's biological certainty, and a family that prosecutors argued had drawn a tight circle around one of their own and held that circle against every effort to penetrate it. The defense presented the argument that the prosecution's case was built on absence, the absence of a body, the absence of a murder weapon, the absence of a confirmed crime scene, the absence of a confession, the absence of any eyewitness to any act of killing. In a legal system where the burden of proof rests entirely and always on the prosecution, those absences, the defense argued, should carry real weight with the jury and should create the kind of reasonable doubt that demands an acquittal. The jury heard that argument, and they rejected it entirely. On July 8, 2025, Brooks Houck was found guilty of murder and of tampering with physical evidence. The verdict was structured in a way that allowed the jury to convict him as either the person who directly caused Crystal's death or as someone who directed and facilitated others in doing so, because the evidence did not need to establish precisely which role he played in order to establish that he bore full criminal responsibility for what was done to her. Joseph Lawson was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and tampering with physical evidence. In September of 2025, Brooks Houck was sentenced to spend the rest of his natural life in prison. Inside that courtroom on the day of sentencing, Tommy Ballard stood, and she spoke directly to the man who had been convicted of murdering her daughter. She told him that he had received a lifetime in prison as his sentence. She told him that she had received a lifetime of grief and pain and loss as hers. And then she asked him the question she has been asking since the morning of July 5, 2015, the question that no verdict and no sentence and no legal proceeding can answer for her, the question that sits at the center of everything this case has ever been about. She asked him where Crystal was. He said nothing. He gave her nothing. He sat in silence, and that silence was the final answer he chose to offer the mother of the woman he was convicted of killing. The Crystal Rogers case has become one of the most significant and closely studied modern examples of what prosecutors and legal scholars refer to as a no-body murder conviction, a verdict of homicide obtained in a court of law without the victim's physical remains ever having been recovered. These cases are rare in American legal history and extraordinarily difficult to prosecute successfully. The burden the state carries in such a case is immense, because it must prove not merely that something terrible occurred, but that that something was a deliberate criminal act, and that a specific named individual bears legal responsibility for it. All without the most foundational category of evidence that homicide investigations have historically depended upon. The prosecution in this case constructed its argument on 5 distinct and mutually reinforcing pillars, each one necessary, and all of them more powerful together than any single one could have been on its own. The first was behavioral evidence, the simple and undeniable reality that Crystal Rogers' disappearance, leaving behind her phone, her keys, her purse, her car, and 5 children she was universally described as never going anywhere without, was flatly incompatible with any credible theory of voluntary absence. The FBI's own profile stated it in plain language. That established, documented, consistent behavioral pattern made the idea that Crystal had simply chosen to walk away from her life implausible to any jury that was genuinely paying attention. The second pillar was digital forensics, specifically the fact that Crystal's phone was manually shut off at 11:57 in the evening, and the cell tower and device data that placed Brooks Houck at locations and at times that directly contradicted the account he had provided to investigators. A suspect's own phone, when it tells a story different from the one the suspect is telling, functions as a silent and entirely disinterested witness whose testimony cannot be coached or retracted. The third pillar was physical trace evidence, the hair found inside the white Buick that was described as consistent with Crystal's, combined with the cadaver dog's alert to the same vehicle. DNA testing was inconclusive and could not establish a confirmed profile, but both findings, taken together and placed alongside everything else the prosecution was presenting, contributed meaningfully to the larger picture that the jury was being asked to evaluate. The fourth pillar was witness testimony, drawn from multiple individuals who described conversations in which Crystal's fate had been openly referenced, a payment of $50,000 for moving a vehicle, statements about a woman with 5 children who needed to be dealt with, horrifying comments about the disposal of human remains. Individually, each witness account can be challenged, cross-examined, and questioned for bias or motive. But assembled together, they described a recognizable social world in which what had been done to Crystal Rogers was known, discussed, and financially compensated. The fifth and perhaps most powerful pillar of all was the cover-up itself, the undisputed fact that someone had taken Crystal's car from the location where she was last seen, driven it to a different location, staged it to appear abandoned, and left it there for investigators to find. Innocent people do not move and stage the cars of missing women. The existence and the execution of that cover-up told the jury something essential about what had already happened before the car was moved, and the jury understood precisely what it was being told. 3 men stand convicted. 2 are in the process of appeal. Nick Houck faces a pending perjury charge that has not yet been fully resolved, and Crystal Rogers has not been found. This is what separates the Crystal Rogers case from the cases where a jury's verdict brings something that feels like an ending. The conviction is real. The life sentence handed to Brooks Houck is real. The 17 years given to Stephen Lawson are real. And yet Sherry Ballard still does not know where her daughter is. She still cannot bring Crystal home. She still cannot give her a proper burial or a marked place in the earth where her grandchildren can go and feel close to their mother. Brooks Houck, sentenced to spend the rest of his life inside a prison, possesses no obvious legal incentive to cooperate with investigators or to tell Crystal's family what was done with her remains. He has chosen silence consistently and completely. Tommy Ballard's murder remains a separate and entirely unhealed wound, running alongside everything else this family has endured. The FBI has never publicly established a provable legal connection between Tommy's shooting and Crystal's case, but the timing has never left anyone's consciousness who has followed this story. 16 months after Crystal disappeared, on family property, while Tommy was actively, physically, personally searching for his daughter. One shot fired with precision, no arrest made, no suspect identified, no justice delivered. The FBI's reward of $10,000 remains unclaimed and will remain so until someone decides that silence is no longer something they are willing to carry. Crystal's son, Eli, the child she shared with Brooks Houck, grew up in the care of Brooks' sister after his father was convicted of murdering his mother. He was 2 years old the summer Crystal disappeared. He is a teenager now, growing up inside the strange and specific grief of a child who lost both parents at once, one to violence and one to the justice that followed it. Crystal's 5 children have given testimony in courtrooms, have sat through hearings and proceedings and press conferences, and have watched a legal system work slowly and imperfectly towards something that contains the shape of justice without being able to deliver the thing that justice is supposed to ultimately make possible, which is the ability to grieve fully, to bury someone properly, to have a place to go and a grave to stand beside and something final to hold on to. What they have not received, what no verdict and no sentence and no number of convictions can provide, is an answer to the most human question at the center of everything this case has ever been. Not who did this, not what happens to them now, but where is she? Somewhere in Kentucky, beneath a subdivision or across a field or in the ground under land that has not yet been searched, Crystal Maria Rogers is still waiting to come home. And until she does, this story does not have an ending, it only has a pause. Before we close today, we want to ask you something, and we want you to be completely honest with us in the comments below. If you were the parents of Crystal Rogers, who would have been your first suspect? And do you think Brooks Houck deserves the punishment he was given? Tell us exactly what you think. Drop your honest answer in the comments section below, because this is the kind of conversation that keeps cases like Crystal's alive in the public consciousness, and that matters more than most people realize. If Crystal's story moved you today, if her name is one you think more people should know and more people should say out loud, please share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below and tell us you want more stories like this one. Hit the like button because it genuinely helps this channel reach more people who care about cases like Crystal's. And if you have not yet subscribed to True Crime Web, please do that right now. The reason cases like this get solved, sometimes after 8 years, sometimes after a decade, sometimes after even longer than that, is because people refuse to let them be forgotten. Because they keep sharing and talking and asking and demanding. Because they treat the names of the missing and the dead as something worth protecting and preserving. We tell these stories at True Crime Web because the people inside them deserve to be so much more than a headline that fades. We will see you in the next one.